Welcome to Virtual History Tours, your guide to people, places, and events that have shaped the world we live in. You've accessed Understanding the Constitution, the executive branch. Your tour will begin in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome, I'm Allison, your tour guide, and I'm going to take you on a video tour of the executive branch of our federal government. That's the branch that carries out the laws and oversees the government. Who heads the executive branch? Why, the chief executive, the President of the United States. So let's start our tour at the President's home, the White House in Washington, D.C. This is the White House. The address, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Every president, except George Washington, our first president, has lived in this beautiful mansion. But the White House isn't just the place where the president lives. It's where he works, too. Before we go inside and take a look around, let's talk about how the presidency, the executive branch, and the whole federal government came to be. For that, we have to travel back in time to 1787, and that's where we're going now. This is Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It's called that because this is where, in 1776, the leaders of the 13 colonies declared their independence from Great Britain and King George III. It is also the place where the leaders of the 13 states came in 1787 to write a constitution for the new country. What's a constitution? A constitution is a framework or an outline for a government. The people who came here in 1787 didn't actually plan to write a new constitution. They only wanted to revise the one that was already in place. It was called the Articles of Confederation. A confederation is a very loose association of strong, independent parts. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states, the parts, had most of the power. The central government had very little. But that government wasn't working very well. Why? Well, let's hear what two important leaders of the time have to say. First, James Madison of Virginia.
This government cannot succeed because the Articles of Confederation lack the great principles of a political system. It's merely a treaty of friendship between the various states.
Now let's see what Alexander Hamilton of New York has to say.
The fundamental deficiency with this government is that Congress has no power. Congress must have powers to deal with national problems. And there is no central court system, so when various states have a dispute, there is no place for them to go to work out their differences. The third deficiency, and it is a great one, is that there is no central leader, no chief executive the people can point to as the head of government.
So, a convention was called to meet in Philadelphia in May of 1787 to revise the Articles and make them stronger. Remember, Alexander Hamilton said that the reason the Articles were so weak was that there was no Congress with any power, no national court system, and no central leader? Well, a plan was presented to the convention to deal with those issues. Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia made the presentation, but it was really the work of James Madison. It was called the Virginia Plan.
The Virginia Plan called for the government to be divided into 3 departments or branches. The legislative branch, which would enact the laws, the executive branch, which would see that the laws were carried out, and the judicial branch, which would see that justice was done under the law.
Madison's idea took hold. After some debate, a resolution was passed.
A national government ought to be established consisting of a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary.
The delegates had taken a bold step. Now, instead of just revising the Articles, they would create a new constitution. Many people contributed to the writing of the Constitution, but no one was more important than James Madison. His contribution was so great that he is known as the father of the Constitution. Why did Madison think it was so important to divide or separate the powers of government into three branches?
The separation of powers was very important. We had to guard against the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in the hands of one person, or a few people, or even a group. It doesn't matter if the powerful are elected, self-appointed, or born to their office. If the powers aren't separated, the result is tyranny.
Once they decided to write a new constitution, the delegates went to work on specific issues. Creating the executive branch was particularly difficult because there really wasn't any model to follow. As colonists, Americans had been ruled by a powerful king and royal governors, but they had just fought a war to get rid of that kind of leader. That's one reason that the Articles had no real chief executive. But it was clear to most everyone that there had to be a strong executive. And much of the debate in the convention revolved around the executive branch. James Madison, who took careful notes at the convention, describes some of the most important questions.
There were a number of issues concerning the executive debated at the convention. The first was whether the executive should be a single person or a plurality, a committee. Many thought that having a single executive would be putting too much power into one person's hands. But we soon realized that that would be preferable to having a committee, a group of strong-minded individuals arguing and fighting. That seemed much more dangerous. Besides, everyone at the convention knew that the first chief executive would be General George Washington. No other person had his stature and commanded the respect of all than he did. In fact, we had chosen Washington to be the presiding officer at the convention. Once we agreed to a single executive, we considered how many years that person should serve and whether or not he should be permitted to be reelected. There was much concern about the possibility of creating an hereditary executive. Up until almost the final days of debate, we thought the executive would be elected for a single 7-year term. But in the end, we decided on a 4-year term with no limit on the number of times he could be reelected. And of course, we provided for a vice president to take over in case the president was unable to serve.
In addition to the debate on whether or not the executive should be a single person or a committee, and how many years the term of office should be, the convention also debated how the executive should be elected.
Some wanted the people to elect the president directly. Others thought the average citizen wouldn't be informed enough to make such a momentous decision. In the end, it was decided that special people, called electors, would choose the president. It was left up to the legislature of each state to decide how their electors would be chosen. I want to take a moment here to mention something that anyone studying the Constitution should know, and that is the important role that compromise played at the convention. For every question and for every issue, there were many, always many, many differing opinions. Those opinions were strongly held and often very forcefully presented. In fact, the debates got quite heated at times. But in every instance, the delegates were able to compromise and find solutions that all could agree to. And that, I'm sure, is why we were successful.
On September 17th, 1787, after 4 months of debate and compromise, the Constitution was sent to the states to be ratified. With the acceptance of New Hampshire the following June, the Constitution became official. In April 1789, in New York City, the temporary capital of the United States, George Washington was sworn in as president. He took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall. It's the same oath that every president since has taken. Now, let's go over to the White House and take a closer look at the president and what he does. Oh, you'll notice that we keep saying he when we talk about the president. That's because so far in our history, all presidents have been men. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says it has to be that way. What does it take to be elected president? Well, here's what the Constitution says. To be president, a person has to be a natural-born citizen of the United States, 35 years old, and have lived in the United States for 14 years. The president serves a 4-year term and can be re-elected. The framers of the Constitution didn't put a limit on the number of terms the president can serve. But that was changed in 1951 when the 22nd Amendment became law. It says that the president can only be elected to 2 terms. There have also been changes to the Constitution that affect how the president is elected. Remember, we heard James Madison explain that the president isn't elected directly by the people, but by a group called the Electoral College. And every state gets to decide for itself how its electors are chosen. Well, that's still the way the president is elected today. You might be surprised to hear that, since we've all seen candidates for president campaigning across the country trying to get people's votes. And we've seen the big election in November that's called the popular election, and then the winner being declared president. In fact, what people are really voting for when they go into the polling booth isn't the candidate directly, but electors pledge to vote for that candidate. Because today, in most states, whoever wins the popular election gets all the state's electoral votes. How do we determine how many electoral votes each state has? Well, each state gets a number of electors equal to its representation in Congress. That means the number of senators, which is always 2, plus the number of representatives in the House of Representatives. The number of representatives a state has is based on its population. So, the greater the population of a state, the more electoral votes it has. There are also 3 electors for the District of Columbia. There are 538 electors in the Electoral College. To be declared president, a candidate has to get a majority, more than half of the votes of the Electoral College. That means 270 of the 538 votes cast. If no candidate gets a majority, then the election is decided by Congress. Here's how the Constitution describes the presidency.
The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America.
That's pretty general. The Constitution also spells out certain specific powers the president has. It says that he is the commander-in-chief of the nation's armed forces, the head of executive departments, such as the Treasury Department, the State Department, and the Labor Department, the nation's chief diplomat. That means chief representative of the country in dealing with foreign countries. The president also has the right to grant pardons to people convicted of certain federal crimes, and the right to appoint important government officials such as federal judges. The president shares some of these powers with the other branches of the government. For example, the president can appoint government officials, but the Senate has to approve the appointments. As chief representative in relations with foreign countries, the president can make treaties, but the Senate has to approve them. This is an example of a system built into the Constitution called checks and balances. Checks and balances means that each branch of the government has some say over what the other branches do. So no one branch of the government can get too powerful, and none can function without the cooperation of the others. It's an assurance that power is kept in balance. So, for example, the President nominates federal judges to the judicial branch, a check on the judiciary. And the Congress has a check on both by having the authority to approve or reject the nominations. One of the most powerful checks the President has is the veto. That means that after Congress has passed a bill, the President can stop it, veto it, so it doesn't become law.
At the Constitutional Convention, there were many debates and many different opinions on the presidential veto. I thought we should give the executive that power so we would not have a government dominated by the legislature. Others thought the power too great. The president, they said, would be more tyrannical than King George III. In the end, once again, we resolved that problem through compromise. We agreed that the president could veto legislation, but the Congress could take another vote. If 2/3 of the House and Senate each voted in favor of the legislation, they would override the veto, and it would become law.
One special check that Congress has is called impeachment. Impeachment means that Congress can remove the president from office. Each House of Congress plays a different role in the impeachment process. The House brings charges against the president, and the Senate acts as a court. The framers saw the ability of Congress to impeach and remove the president as the greatest check on the power of the executive.
We considered it absolutely necessary for there to be some provision for protecting the nation from a chief executive who might be negligent in his duties or incapable of performing them, or one who would engage in oppressing the people or even betraying the nation to a foreign power. The idea that the executive could only serve for a limited term of 4 years wasn't protection enough. But it was also decided that the process of removing the president from office should not be easy, because doing so is a very serious action.
In our nation's history, 2 presidents have been impeached: Andrew Johnson in 1868 and Bill Clinton in 1999. But neither was found guilty by the Senate and removed from office. In fact, only one president has ever left the White House before his term ended, except for those who died in office. That was Richard Nixon. Just before the House was going to vote on charges of impeachment in 1974, President Nixon resigned. The vice president's only real job, according to the Constitution, is to be the president of the Senate. But he can only vote to break a tie. Otherwise, he has no say. John Adams, the country's first vice president, didn't think much of the job.
My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived.
Of course, the vice president's most important job is to be ready to step in if the president dies or is unable to fulfill his duties. The Constitution has been amended a few times to make sure that that process works efficiently. The first vice president to replace a president who died in office was John Tyler. That happened in 1841. President William Henry Harrison had only been in office for 1 month when he died. Tyler took the oath of office as president, but not everyone was willing to accept him. In fact, many people referred to Tyler as his accidency. The way the Constitution was originally written, once the vice president became president, there was no longer anyone in the second spot. And that happened quite a few times in our history. The 25th Amendment, passed in 1967, changed all that. Now, if there is no vice president, the president nominates someone to fill the office. Both houses of Congress vote on the nomination. The person becomes vice president. There's one other duty the president has that we haven't talked about yet. The Constitution requires the president to report to Congress from time to time and tell how the country is doing. This is called the State of the Union Address. The president delivers his address in the chamber of the House of Representatives. Behind him sits the vice president, the head of the Senate. Next to him is the Speaker of the House, the chief officer of that body. In the audience are the president's cabinet officers, all the members of the Supreme Court, and the entire Congress, both the House and the Senate. The three branches of government coming together to fulfill their obligations just as the framers of the Constitution hoped it would be. That concludes our virtual tour of the executive branch of the Constitution. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.